everybody. Pleasure to be here. First time I've been in the factory, been in the centre, and I was lucky enough to get a bit of a tour this morning, and really inspirational. And it's apt that this conference is about be the solution, and it's innovation and centres like this that really will be the solution as we drive to a transition to net zero. Thanks for having me this morning. I'm inspired by Terry's talk this morning. It's great to see the regulator taking a very collaborative approach, which is absolutely the right thing to do, and it's great to hear. So I'm at COP next week, and like many of you, I've been paying close attention to the coverage of the event over the past week. I've been down in London this week actually, and it's great to see the coverage. Very positive about Glasgow, very positive about the way that we've been able to come together as a city to host this event, and also facilitate some of the big announcements this week and some of the big discussions. One of the things that jumped out at me this week was listening to David Attenborough's opening speech at COP. And it's easy to be confused by lots of numbers around the transition to net zero. And we talk about targets, we talk about temperature changes and the type of work that we have to do to accelerate to net zero. But David Attenborough said, really, there's only one number that matters, and that's the measure of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which is currently sitting at 417 parts per million. Which compares to 278 at pre-industrial levels. So they're really stark, the work that we have to do to accelerate the transition to net zero. One of the things about numbers is that very often we take this as a long-term game, some things we have to do to prevent something from happening in the future. By work at the British Safety Council, we are seeing climate change have a massive impact right now, where poor air quality is causing the deaths of 40,000 people per year in the UK. And I'll be down in the Broomhill outside COP campaigning to raise awareness of the impact of air quality today on outdoor workers and people across the UK, because it's having a massive impact. And climate change is something that affects people now, not something that's to be prevented in the future. So, why is it important for the built environment? Why is it important for construction? Well, it's because we're 40% of the problem. Globally, construction and the built environment represent 40% of emissions. So we need to change fast if we've got any hope of transitioning to net zero at the pace we need to. Out of that 40%, we're seeing 75% roughly be attributed to operational carbon and 25% embodied, but that's very likely to flip as we start to become much more, have smart buildings and start to use energy more efficiently and so on, and it all becomes about embodied carbon and about refurbishment rather than new build. One of the challenges that we are seeing in the industry is that the real estate sector is not as far advanced as a number of other sectors in this space, and therefore the real estate sector tends to take a more long-term view. What's the short-term gains that I'm going to achieve by decarbonising? And they look at things through a financial lens rather than actually this is about survival. The banks, the financial industry is much more heavily regulated and an audited sector, an audited business than the real estate sector. And if those that own assets have not yet formalised a plan to transition to net zero, I'd be very, very surprised if they were to get any form of loan from their bank in 2 years' time. So this is about, do you want to stay in business? Never mind about making financial returns in the short term. A bit like Terry's comment earlier about this is about survival. It's not about it's a broken business model, and we need to look at that. So in terms of Turner Townsend, we have been advising clients right across the globe on their net zero transition. And we've been delivering decarbonisation projects right across the UK and beyond reducing carbon emissions by several 100,000 tonnes of carbon on an annual basis. But in order to have integrity in what we do, and in order to be able to talk to clients with any degree of confidence, we need to have a proper leading net zero strategy ourselves to be able to talk with any degree of authority. We were one of the first 500 companies globally to get our net zero targets verified by the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is aligned to climate models and is in line with the UN's race to net zero requirements. And I've got a video here that will tell you a little bit more. Fingers crossed. So we've baselined our carbon emissions from 2018, and it takes a long time to properly baseline your emissions. If you've gone through it yourself as an organisation, you'll appreciate the importance of getting the data right. We measured 18,500 metric tonnes of CO2, which we were emitting globally as an organisation, which is equivalent of just under 3,000 flights around the world, which really shocked us, actually. And we had an internal department set up in order to provide a plan of change, and also to work with third-party consultants to come in and help us hold us to account. There was 3 major steps that we took in order to move this forward. We funded projects to avoid and remove emissions, so thereby becoming carbon neutral as of January this year, which is a first step. Secondly, we set science-based target initiative verified targets that saw us set real strong targets to reduce our direct and indirect emissions based on that 2018 baseline. And as we reduced our emissions as far as possible, we then had a step 3, which is about offsetting to investing in projects to decarbonise, at the same time as then moving towards conserving projects as well. So what that does is that takes us to a net zero target of 2030, but we're certainly on a trajectory to become net zero a lot sooner than that. And that's also verified by the Science Based Target Initiative. So that's been quite an interesting journey. There was 8 key action areas that we took in order to be able to move that forward in terms of that roadmap to net zero, and I'll talk about 3 of them quite briefly. One of them is about transitioning to renewable energy, and as we lease our assets, it's about compelling our landlords to really create the infrastructure to allow us to be able to do that. Second thing is about business travel, and as a consultancy, business travel makes up quite a large proportion, and we've made some internal commitments to reduce that significantly. And then thirdly, in terms of Scope 3 emissions, is about working with our supply chain to really drive their decarbonisation as well. And if we're to do that, we see almost a reduction of 80% across the board. So there's some significant steps that we're taking to be able to help move to net zero. In terms of moving forward to the real estate sector, we've been through that journey, and the next step is then us advising clients on how they can do the same. And at Turner Townsend, we work with some big global clients, as well as some big clients in the UK. And it's been quite interesting talking to them about their transition to net zero. What we are seeing is corporates tend to commit to a target of when they're going to get to net zero, 2030, 2040, 2050, but they do not have a route map of how to get there. And that's something that you'll see that's quite common. And for those real estate departments, so big clients with large assets, large portfolios, it's very, very rare for that division to have a plan of how to get to net zero, and at least a target of getting to net zero. And there's a lot of talk around setting targets and not a lot of action around how to get there. And that's the challenge that we've been helping clients try and overcome. And we've got some good insight into what we're seeing, both at a local and a global level. One of the challenges that in the real estate sector is the very real risk of having stranded assets. If we do not invest in assets to become green, then there's a very real risk that we become stranded, and that can, going back to business models, that's a real wake-up call in terms of business models. There's also a challenge around supply chain, which is quite interesting, and we're seeing that the supply chain challenge is around organisations that are attempting to decarbonise in different ways, but the demand is preventing a supply chain from being formed that allows scaling up of decarbonisation across the sector. And it's great to see pockets of innovation happening. It's great to see some organisations, especially smaller organisations, set up and try and address some of the challenges that we're seeing. But in terms of if every real estate client wanted to decarbonise tomorrow, there wouldn't be a supply chain there to help deliver that. And sometimes you see government come up with policies and targets and so on, but if there's no supply chain to achieve those targets, then it's very difficult to be able to do that. So we do need to look at investment in supply chain. We need to look at how we can create the expertise, the skills, the techniques, the will, because the solutions are there. We've just got to get the skills and expertise and capability and volume of such to be able to help deliver. There's changing regulation across the globe, and we're seeing that translate into acceleration of transition, and also the changing of the trajectory of net zero. Some organisations have moved the trajectory quite significantly in the last 12 months. And you'll even see the UK earlier moved some of the targets from 2050 to 2035 in terms of some of the targets that were set, and that's causing organisations to reflect. There's also a brand issue. Some organisations attempt to pull the wool over people's eyes and greenwash, and the public are becoming very informed about this issue, and they won't take big headlines at face value. They will look and want to understand how are you doing it, let's see the data, has it been baselined, and they will hold those organisations to account. So I do think for organisations that seek to decarbonise and seek to transition to net zero, integrity is so important, authenticity is so important, and it's got to be done right. In terms of a route map to net zero, so starting off with, I want to decarbonise, I've got lots of assets, where do I start? And what we've tried to do is to take an industry standard approach, which is about, first of all, baselining. And it sounds a simple thing to do, but unless we have the integrity of a strong baseline, understanding exactly what your emissions are to begin with, then everything else is flawed from there on if it's not done properly. I tend to find two types of organisation. Organisations that say, yes, we've baselined, we've got the information, it's in a folder somewhere, it's fine. I always raise my eyebrows and think that's not, you've not done it properly. Organisations that say, yes, it's been a nightmare. I've been working on it for 12 months. I've had 10 people working on it. I'm pulling my hair out. You think, okay, you're getting closer. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's got to be done properly. Unless you've done that properly, it's very difficult to move forward. The increasing operational efficiency, reducing waste, that's being more productive, making sure that energy use is as efficient as possible as a next step. The clean energy on site. Some big clients with large campuses and so on, it's especially in certain parts of the world, it's very easy to be able to build solar, to create solar energy from their on-site campuses. If it's possible, it's always a great thing to do. Then it's moving on to trying to make sure your energy supplies comes from renewable sources, offset the remaining emissions, and then start again. And it sounds quite straightforward in terms of that, start to finish, but actually doing it properly can be quite complex. Now, organisations that have multiple assets, and I think about the local authorities that we work with in the UK, right through to global organisations that work right across every corner of the globe. And it's so difficult to think about looking at my portfolio, looking at the different types of assets. Some are owned, some are leased. I've got capital projects in flow. I've got some that are planned. I'm looking to divest in some areas. I'm about to acquire another business, and I don't know really what they have. There's so much complexity. And then it's about the organisational construct, how the different stakeholders, the different work streams. If you're a head of real estate in a big organisation, it's an incredibly complex picture to even understand what you have, never mind baselining it properly and having a plan to move forward. And you tend to find that organisations have lots of other projects in flow. You've got lighting projects over here, you've got EV projects over there, you've got some retrofit happening perhaps over there, and it's not managed centrally. What we're seeing best practice clients adopt is a program management approach. So that's taking the whole net zero endeavour and taking it in a program way. So what that does is that it brings control to chaos, and chaos it absolutely is. And if we want to achieve net zero at the same time as make sure that your business continues to operate, that you are controlling costs, that you're reducing risk, that you're bringing consistency, that you've got that control, you've got good governance around it, then you really need a program approach. And in the real estate world, real estate professionals understand that. They understand programs, they understand trying to drive a program approach with multiple projects happening at the same time and trying to bring that control. And what that does is it delivers enterprise-level commitments into a manageable program of activities and allows clients to be able to measure performance as they go along. And for some organisations who have set 20-year targets, the last thing you want to do is to set that as your program. You've got to get it into bite-sized pieces, where it might be 3-5 years, and you build it into those type of programs. And what that does is it allows that kind of end-to-end control, allows you to have, understand your financial commitments, understand your financial controls, allows you to scale into where there's an opportunity to do so, and is also delivers value for money. And that's what we're seeing organisations who are serious about this adopt, and the benefits of that is you start to get results pretty fast, because you start to look at low-hanging fruit to begin with. How do you start to move things forward? Where are your biggest emissions? How can you start to change that quickly? And then it builds confidence in the organisation that you're starting to move faster and faster and faster. That builds up momentum, and then it moves forward from that way. And I think that that programme approach is really yielding a lot of success in the sector, and unlocks the benefits of the approach to get to net zero. So there's four areas that we are supporting clients who are at different stages of maturity. So the route map essentially is I want to get to net zero. My exec team have set a target of 2040. What do I do? And we can set route maps of how to get there, and that's been quite useful. The second thing is about the delivery partner, which is about actually delivering net zero and being that programme delivery partner. And I've got some case studies where I can refer to some of those examples and perhaps bring it to life. The retrofit side is an interesting area, and you'll start to see more and more of that over the next few years. There's something like 80 or 90% of all assets in the UK have to be retrofitted, and will still exist actually in 2050. So there's the government are started to trickle down funding to help pilots around retrofit. And there's a question about heat pumps earlier, and the different innovations that are available to help retrofit. And what we're seeing is the funding being used to try and prove the model, to try and test out what works, how can it be scaled, what's the performance levels, over what period of time, can we build a supply chain at the same time, and it'll be centres like this that will help in that endeavour. In London in particular, the Greater London Authority, which is sort of umbrella for all the local boroughs, have set aside funding to help local boroughs access in order to pilot to retrofit projects on different types of assets, whether it's social housing or whether it's workplaces, and that kind of thing can be quite useful in being able to test out the model and what works. And we're seeing that starting to cascade outside of London into other parts of the UK. If you start to, over the past few weeks, there's been some interesting comments from Glasgow City Council about some of the decarbonisation retrofit thinking in the near future. So I'm sure we'll start to see that here. And it can make a big difference as well. It can make a huge difference. And there's a social aspect to it as well, because what it does, especially for things like social housing, it can create affordable, warm homes for people. So what it does is it not only does it reduce carbon emissions, but it also starts to move people out of fuel poverty, which is a huge issue as well. So there's a win-win. The fourth box there, performance accelerator, is quite an interesting one, and that's more for more mature clients who are starting to look at how they blend their digital strategy with their net zero strategy and try to be much more productive. So what that's about is organisations looking at their digital strategy for real estate. So what that might be, it might be creating digital twins for their assets. And if they do that, what they're able to do is start to predict different scenarios and their energy use and building performance during that time. So what that does is it helps link back to their net zero strategy about reducing emissions as much as possible and reducing waste at the same time. And if you lock those three in together, what that does is it can really make a big difference in terms of emissions, but also in terms of how you're able to gather data to help inform performance of the asset. I think one of the things that is not talked about often enough is climate resilience. And there was a great photo, I think it was earlier this year, where I think it was Bristol, where there was a line of Tesla charging stations in a car park, but the car park was underwater due to floods. And you think, you can spend all the money you want on lots of infrastructure, but unless you get the climate resilience bit right, there's no point. And therefore, looking ahead and making sure that the asset has a longer lifespan, making sure it's protected against climate change that is happening, is so important as well. And I think that that's an area that we're seeing more and more clients start to become aware of, and the impact of what that means. I think you referred to Jonathan Porritt earlier in the previous Q&A, and we were doing a lecture with Jonathan last week, and Jonathan raised some really interesting comments around what he sees the future like. And to those of you that aren't aware, Jonathan Porritt's a kind of leading environmentalist. And he was talking about the sea levels and the rising of the sea levels and what's likely to happen in 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, depending on the overall temperature rise. And some of the predictions were really stark. And for those that are investing in assets in vulnerable places, it's such an important area to look at. So I think that looking at that climate resilience and making sure our assets are designed for future climate change is important as well, because the longer the asset life cycle, lifespan, the lower the carbon as we look to either demolish or replace. So finally, on some case studies. So I talked about retrofit in terms of how retrofit is a growing area, and I think that our experience of retrofit is mostly in the south, but you are seeing other geographies start to accelerate retrofit in a different way. So for the UK, retrofit is about how do we make sure we've got replaced gas boilers, how do we make sure that we have good insulation, we've got good cladding, we've got potentially some solar panels that reduce energy from fossil fuels, that we reduce energy usage because we keep the houses warm. But you look at the flip side of that, and you see in Dubai, for example, where you've got hundreds of high-rise glass buildings, they're also attempting to retrofit. But they're looking at very different things. And they're looking at designs that keep the sun out. They're looking at designs that create solar energy. They're looking at designs that are much more efficient in terms of heating, ventilation, air conditioning. So you are seeing a growth in retrofit in some other regions, which is perhaps not the first thing you think of when you think about retrofit. The accelerators that on the left there, which is about retrofitting workplaces, retrofitting public buildings. It's no surprise that the public sector is trying to prove the model, if you like, before it becomes affordable for the private sector. So there is an element of that coming through there. You'll have seen the government with the construction playbook, the IPA route map. You're seeing initiatives come through from central government that what that does is it tries to create change, transform how construction projects are delivered in the public sector, with a view to creating a market to help the private sector. And that's true with retrofit, and we're seeing that will be a growing area in the next 5-10 years, and I'm sure that centres, as I said, will play a big part in that. We're also seeing a refurbishment decision as opposed to a new build, and that's been quite an interesting move for responsible clients are looking and saying, right, do I actually need to build this new build? Can I look at an asset and refurbish it? And we've been involved in quite an interesting project in London with the Crown Estate, who have looked to refurbish a building with a net zero standard. And that's been quite interesting to see how a client's been able to take that from first principles and move that forward to be able to deliver. and we're seeing more and more of that. So it's, you know, I think looking back in the last 2 years, there's been a huge momentum swing, and the hope is that COP and the discussions that have come out of COP and will certainly accelerate that. You know, the discussions that I'm having on a day-to-day basis certainly suggest that you know, this will be the biggest priority for the sector in the next decade and beyond. You know, it's really important that the sector comes together to collaborate in order to deliver the solutions that are needed. Because as I said at the start, 40% of the problem, and therefore it needs to change fast. Thank you.